10 million people visit the Palace of Versailles every year. They walk through the Hall of Mirrors, they admire the gardens, they take selfies in front of the Golden Gates. But here is what those 10 million tourists do not see. Behind the gold leaf, behind the 357 mirrors and the 1,200 fireplaces, Versailles was one of the filthiest, most dangerous, and most disturbing places in Europe. A palace where courtiers urinated in the hallways, where the king's own mistress allegedly performed satanic rituals with a defrocked priest, where thousands of workers died just to build it, and their families were thrown in prison for complaining. So how did the most beautiful palace in the world become a monument to human cruelty? To understand that, we need to go back to one night in 1661 that changed everything. If you are into stories like this, the parts of history they do not show you, make sure you are subscribed. On August 17th of that year, the French superintendent of finances, Nicolas Fouquet, threw a party. And not just any party. He invited King Louis XIV to his newly completed chateau, Vaux-le-Vicomte, for an evening of entertainment that included fireworks, a play by Molière, and a feast served on solid gold plates. Fouquet thought he was impressing the king. He was wrong. When Louis XIV saw this palace, something inside him snapped. How dare a minister live in more splendor than the king himself? Within 3 weeks, Fouquet was arrested and he would spend the rest of his life in prison. But Louis did not stop there. He actually hired Fouquet's architect, his landscape designer, and his interior decorator, and he set them to work at a location about 12 miles outside Paris on a swampy piece of land with a small hunting lodge that his father, Louis XIII, had built decades earlier. Louis XIV looked at that muddy patch of ground and told them to build the greatest palace the world had ever seen. And that is exactly what they did, but the cost of building it went far beyond money. Over 36,000 workers were brought in for the construction. They worked 12-hour days, sometimes through the night, on scaffolding that was barely held together. Men fell from heights constantly. Heavy stones crushed limbs. Disease swept through the work camps because there were no proper sanitation facilities anywhere near the site. According to historical records, 5 or more workers died every single week during the major construction periods. The situation got so bad that 3 hospitals had to be built just to handle the constant flow of injuries. Louis XIV responded to all of this suffering by ignoring it. Workers who went on strike demanding better conditions were dismissed. Family members who confronted the king after losing loved ones to the building site were imprisoned. Historians recount a story about a mother whose son died during construction. She found the king during one of his inspection visits and screamed curses at him in front of his entire court. She was hauled away. The construction continued, but the human cost of building Versailles was just the beginning of its horrors. By 1682, Louis XIV had moved the entire French government and aristocracy into his new palace. And this is where things get really disturbing. See, Versailles was not just a home, it was a trap. Louis forced every major noble family in France to live at the palace. If you were a duke, a count, or anyone with political ambitions, you lived at Versailles or you lost everything. Your lands, your titles, your influence, gone. Once the aristocrats were inside those gilded walls, Louis controlled every minute of their day. The morning ritual alone was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Every single day, a select group of nobles would file into the king's bedchamber to watch him wake up. This was not optional. This was the lever du roi, and it was one of the most coveted appointments at court. Nobles fought, schemed, and bribed their way into the privilege of handing Louis his shirt. Some aristocrats spent their entire fortunes just maintaining appearances at Versailles, desperately trying to stay close to the king. That was the whole point. While these nobles were busy competing over who got to hold the royal bathrobe, they were not back home on their estates building up armies or plotting rebellions. Louis had turned the palace into a pressure cooker of vanity and competition, and it worked perfectly. But here's the part they definitely leave out of the tour guide brochure. Versailles was absolutely disgusting. At its peak, over 10,000 people lived and worked in the palace complex. Royals, aristocrats, government officials, servants, soldiers, everyone packed into this massive structure. The problem? There were almost no toilets, not for the servants, not for the visiting public, and honestly, barely enough for the nobles themselves. The fortunate ones had a closest stool, basically a chair with a removable chamber pot underneath. But most people at Versailles answered nature's call wherever it was most convenient, behind curtains, in stairwells, in the corners of the grand hallways. Ambassadors from foreign courts wrote home in shock about what they saw. One German princess who married into the French court described seeing people relieving themselves in every corner of the galleries outside her rooms. The smell was so overwhelming that Louis XIV eventually ordered the hallways to be cleaned of human waste once a week. He also placed orange trees throughout the palace in an attempt to mask the odor, but visitors still described the stench as enough to make you physically ill. And it gets worse. People in the 17th century did not bathe the way we do. In fact, they believed that hot water opened your pores and let disease into your body. So instead of washing with water, the aristocrats at Versailles simply changed their shirts multiple times a day and drowned themselves in perfume. Louis XIV himself reportedly bathed only a handful of times during his life. His courtiers were not much better. The entire palace was essentially a crowd of thousands of unwashed people in heavy clothing, sweating through layers of silk and lace. And the food situation was not exactly appetizing either. The kitchens were located so far from the dining rooms that by the time servants carried the meals across the palace, the food arrived cold. During winter, it got so brutally cold inside those marble rooms that wine reportedly froze right in the glass at the king's own dinner table. The 1,200 fireplaces barely made a dent against all that stone and marble. But if you think the filth was bad, wait until you hear what was happening in the shadows. In the 1670s, rumors started circulating through Paris and Versailles about a network of poisoners operating among the French aristocracy. What started as whispers turned into one of the most horrifying criminal scandals in French history. It began in 1675 with a woman named Marie-Madeleine d'Aubray, the Marquise de Brinvilliers. She had conspired with her lover to poison her own father and two brothers to secure her inheritance. When she was caught, she was tortured, beheaded, and her body was burned. But her trial opened a door that could never be closed. Police Chief Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie began investigating and quickly discovered that Brinvilliers was far from the only poisoner in Paris. He uncovered an entire underground network of fortune tellers, alchemists, and so-called witches who supplied poisons, love potions, and something far darker to clients across every level of French society. At the center of this network was a woman named Catherine de Chay, known to everyone as La Voisine. She operated out of her home in Paris, mixing perfumes and reading fortunes for the city's elite on the surface. But behind closed doors, La Voisine sold poisons, performed illegal medical procedures, and organized what witnesses described as black masses, satanic ceremonies designed to invoke demonic forces on behalf of her wealthy clients. When police raided her home in 1679, they found vials of poison, mysterious powders, and letters connecting her to members of the highest aristocracy. But the most disturbing discovery was allegedly made in her garden. According to investigators, the remains of 2,500 infants were found buried on her property, though some historians believe these may have been connected to her work as an underground midwife performing secret procedures rather than human sacrifice. But the scandal was about to reach all the way into the king's own bedroom. Among the names in La Voisine's client list was one that made the blood drain from every face at court. Madame de Montespan was not just any noblewoman. She was Louis XIV's official mistress, the mother of 7 of his children, and the most influential woman at Versailles. Some historians called her the real Queen of France. According to testimony extracted during interrogations, La Voisine claimed that Montespan had been a client since 1667. She said the Marquise had purchased aphrodisiacs and participated in black masses with a defrocked priest named Etienne Guibourg, all to keep the king's love focused on her and away from younger rivals. The testimony describes ceremonies where Montespan allegedly lay across an altar while Guibourg performed rituals over her body, reciting invocations to the devil. The most horrifying claim was that these rituals involved the sacrifice of infants, their blood mixed into potions that were supposedly slipped to the king. Whether these specific accusations were true remains a matter of historical debate. Much of the testimony came from people being interrogated under torture, and La Voisin herself was reportedly drunk when she made her most damning statements about Montespan. But the sheer scale of the affair of the poisons was undeniable. By the time the investigation was complete, 442 people had been implicated. 36 were executed, including La Voisin herself, who was burned at the stake in February 1680 in front of a massive crowd. 218 were arrested, and the special tribunal that Louis created to investigate the affair, called the Chambre Ardente, held 210 sessions and issued 319 writs of arrest. If you are finding this video interesting so far, hit subscribe. We cover dark history stories like this every week. Now here's where the cover up begins. When Montespan's name surfaced in the investigation, Louis XIV faced a choice: expose the truth and humiliate the monarchy, or bury it. He chose the burial. Louis suspended the public proceedings of the Chambre Ardente. He ordered the continuation of the investigation in secret, but ensured that Montespan was never formally charged. He then dissolved the tribunal entirely and had all the records sealed under royal order. Many of the key witnesses who had provided the most damaging testimony about the court's involvement were quietly transferred to remote prisons where they would spend the rest of their lives. Montespan was never punished in any legal sense, but her position at court collapsed. Within a few years, she was replaced in the king's affections by Madame de Maintenon, a far more pious woman who promised to restore some moral order to the court. Montespan spent her final years drifting between convents, and the full truth about what happened during those years of poison and ritual was locked away in archives that Louis never intended anyone to read. Versailles resumed its glittering performances as if nothing had happened, but people remembered the rumors, and the palace would claim one more royal victim before its story was over. Marie Antoinette arrived at Versailles in 1770 as a 14-year-old Austrian princess, married off to the future Louis XVI. She walked into a court that was suffocating under its own rituals. Every moment of her life was public. She dressed in front of crowds of noblewomen. She ate in front of spectators, and when she gave birth, the room was packed with strangers, as royal protocol demanded witnesses to ensure the legitimacy of the child. During the birth of her first daughter, so many people crowded into the chamber that the windows had to be smashed open because the queen was fainting from lack of air. Marie Antoinette tried to escape the pressure of court life by retreating to the Petit Trianon, a smaller palace on the Versailles grounds that Louis XVI had given her as a private space. She built a fake peasant village called the Hameau de la Reine, where she and her ladies-in-waiting would dress up and pretend to be country women. It sounds absurd, and it was, but it was also the desperate act of a woman who felt imprisoned by the very luxury surrounding her. Then came the diamond necklace affair in 1785, a scandal where a con artist impersonated Marie Antoinette to purchase an obscenely expensive necklace. The queen had nothing to do with it, but the public did not care. Her reputation was already in ruins. The people of France were starving while the court danced through its golden halls, and Marie Antoinette became the symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy. On October 5th, 1789, a mob of thousands of women marched from Paris to Versailles. They were hungry, they were furious, and they were done waiting. They broke through the palace gates, killed several guards, and demanded that the royal family return to Paris. Louis and Marie Antoinette had no choice. They left Versailles under armed escort, and the palace that had been the center of French power for over a century fell silent. Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in January 1793. He was transported to the scaffold in a glass coach. Marie Antoinette followed 9 months later, but for her, there was no glass coach. She was loaded into a dung cart and paraded through the streets of Paris while crowds jeered. When the blade fell, spectators reportedly soaked their sleeves in her blood. Versailles was stripped of its furnishings during the Revolution. The furniture was sold, the art was scattered, and the palace stood empty for years, a hollow monument to the excess that had consumed it. Today, the Palace of Versailles is one of the most visited landmarks on Earth. The rooms have been restored, the gardens replanted, the fountains flowing again. Visitors walk through the Hall of Mirrors. It is the same hall whose construction cost Venetian mirror makers their lives after France lured them away from Venice, and Venice reportedly sent assassins to kill them for giving away trade secrets. But some visitors have reported experiences that cannot quite be explained. Disembodied footsteps in empty corridors, whispered voices in the gardens at night, full apparitions of figures in period clothing who vanish when approached. In 1901, 2 English academics claimed they accidentally stepped back in time while walking through the gardens near the Petit Trianon, encountering people in 18th century dress who seemed completely real. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, one thing is certain. Versailles was never just a palace. It was a stage built on suffering, maintained through manipulation, and stained by scandal. And the stories buried within its walls are far darker than anything you will read on the placard next to the golden chandelier.